Turning Pro is the perfect book. It's very short, it's precise, it's to the point, it has cool stories, and if you follow the advice in it, if you get to the spirit of it, it's very difficult that your life will not going to become much better. At least this is how I related to it. First, I listened to it as an Audible. I liked it so much that I downloaded it as a Kindle book. And then I also ordered a physical copy. And this morning, I sat down thinking I will read one chapter with my coffee as a morning, get the morning inspiration. Instead, I read the whole book in one go, although I've already read it 2 or 3 times. So this is going to be a video, I don't know how long, where we're going to do a deep dive into the book and also draw some parallels with the set of ideas that I find very inspiring and the philosophy that I find the best guide for life, which is Objectivism. Now, this is a book by Pressfield. His first book was The War of Art, where he talks about resistance, this thing that stands between what we know we have to do for a fulfilling life and what we actually do. In Turning Pro, he goes deeper into the 2 possible different stages in life, the stage of an amateur and the stage of a pro. This is another way of saying the stage of someone who hasn't got a clear purpose or doesn't act on his purpose and someone who does act on his purpose. Or the different stages between a second-hander, someone who lives by values that they're not his values, and the first-hander, someone who knows what he wants and has the integrity to get after it. Without further delay, let's jump in the book. I will read almost all of the I will comment in almost all of the chapters. So in the beginning, he talks about the biggest, one big disease, he calls it, or a condition that keeps many, many people unhappy. And he says that this is living our lives as amateurs. This is when we live our lives not based on what we really want to do, but based on coping, based on doing something which is a substitute. And then why don't we all turn pro, he asks. Well, he says, quote, when we turn pro, we give up a life with which we may have become extremely comfortable. We give up a self that we have come to identify with and to call our own. We may have to give up friends, lovers, even spouses. So what this means is that often we get used to something which is, if we look at it objectively, a miserable life or not a really fulfilling life. For example, I know that if I wouldn't spend so much time following sports, I would be so much better in my calling, which I consider my calling, fighting the battle of ideas. But sports is who I am. It's my childhood memories. It's some of the strongest memories of my life. When I was abroad in the UK, sports was the thing that was my emotional link with my country, with my family, with my friends. So quite often, we know what we have to do, but there is this barrier that if I do what I really need to do, I won't be myself anymore. But then he says, when we finally do turn pro, we found our self-respect. So notice here the important links with objectivism. Pressfield says that turning pro means having a purpose, and through this purpose you also have self-esteem. Now for Ayn Rand, these are 2 of the 3 cardinal values: reason, purpose, self-esteem. So you know what you have to do. Purpose is where everything is directed at, and when you act on it, you gain more self-esteem. So amateur life is easy but unfulfilling. Turning pro, you have a purpose, and when you go after it, you get self-esteem. No matter what this purpose is or how, in terms of, so you don't have to be the greatest artist or to become a millionaire. The important question is this what you really want to do? And he will give us many examples. So how did he first come up with this idea that he could be something better? So Pressfield, and this is another reason why this book is so inspiring, he lived the biggest part of his life, or big part of his life, doing way less than he could have done, not chasing his dream. His dream was to become a writer. Instead, he was working on other jobs, manual labor, driving a truck at some point. So he says that he had a dream one night where he comes to his room. He was living in something like what they would call a hostel. And it was very messy, but in his dreams, he says, I came into my room and found that my shirts had all folded themselves in the drawer, instead of being mashed together in the usual jumbled mess. My boots had crawled out from under the bed, where I normally kick them when I took them off, and had themselves up and set themselves upright and tidy. They had signed themselves. When I woke up, I thought, I'm ambitious. I have ambition. So this dream was basically telling him there's a different mode of existence that is possible to you. And here's again why philosophy is everywhere, how philosophy comes in. He says that he felt guilty about this realization that he has ambition. Because who was I to aspire to rise above my brothers and sisters or to aim to be better than anybody else? So if he were an altruist with a proper sense of the world, that not being benevolent, but everything I have to do has to be for others, he would let go of that ambition. But he had the realization, no, I owe to myself to be something better. So what he did then is he found a very, very small house. It's not even a house, it was mostly a hut where he was sleeping on something like a mattress, and he moved in. He moved out of that hostel situation, and he tried to make something of his life. This was the beginning of his journey. Now, moving in a hut is not achieving anything important, one would say. But for him it was important. Why? Because, quote, to find that house and to move into it was my first act as an adult that embraced the idea of ambition. So ambition, he calls it the sacred fundament of our being. So again, it's very clear that here he's talking about purpose. So he knows at some point he needs to write, so he takes a first step towards that. Now, while he's in that hut, he's visited by a strange visitor, which is a cat. So his life is almost to zero. He hasn't even got a kitchen. He's cooking basically in the fire at the back of the hut. And there's a cat that comes and sees at him. And he feels that even the cat is kind of looking him with pity. But also is looking him with, let's see, can you do something more than that in your life? So for him, this was a sign that he was very, very low, but it was like an omen. Someone came to him, like from the spirits, and said, I'm looking at you, you can do better. If you ask me, that cat symbolizes, of course, his consciousness. Symbolizes the fact that inside his mind and inside his soul, he knew he could be better. And then he came to another realization, that although in that hut he didn't have any personal possessions, the hut was very small, he had something under piles of junk which almost all the time was calling him. And this was his ancient Smith Corona typewriter. And he said, I don't know why I had it with me. By that point, I had given up on the idea that I'd ever be a writer. So he was in his late 20s. And yet, he had it with him, which was a constant nagging that you are not following your purpose. You are not chasing your purpose. And this was eating him inside. So then he talks about shadow careers. What is a shadow career? A shadow career, he says, is a metaphor for a real career. Its shape is similar, its contours feel tantalizingly the same. So for me, my shadow career was being a university lecturer. It sounded like being a public intellectual or fighting the battle of ideas or however you want to call it, but it wasn't the same. I thought I was doing what I wanted to do, but inside me, I knew this was not the case. He says, for example, quote, are you getting your PhD in Elizabethan studies because you're afraid to write the tragedies and comedies that you know you have inside you. Actually, I've known such a person who was a very, very, very talented writer. I've read some stuff from that person, a few pages, very talented. And yet that person never actually wrote. As far as I know, we're not in touch anymore. And instead that person was doing something relevant to literature, but not doing what Pressfield says, give your gift to the world, which is do your own, be a writer. If you want to be a writer, be a writer. So his shadow career, Pressfield's shadow career, was being a truck driver. And you could say, how can be a truck driver be a substitute career for being a writer? Where he says, in two ways. First, metaphorically, he was driving away from writing. He says he loved the idea of the road because he says the road always took you somewhere. He would be in one place, maybe enter a local bar, have a few drinks with the locals, and then he would leave. No commitment. But he says, at the end of the day, the road was taking him nowhere. Except that it was taking him somewhere which was away from his writing. And also when he was younger, he loved, obviously, The Road by Jack Kerouac. So he liked this bohemian lifestyle. Except that what he really loved was not just the lifestyle. He loved that Kerouac was a writer. But he couldn't be a writer. I mean, he could if he tried, but he didn't want to try. He chose the safe option, being a driver. And he says, there's nothing wrong with your amateur life in terms of you might do a decent job. Being a truck driver was a decent job. You make money. And in some ways, in retrospect, your shadow career is your youth, is the hero's journey. So he sees his truck years with sympathy. He's not punishing himself or something. And by coincidence, when he started writing books, his publisher was the same publisher as Jack Kerouac's publisher or something like that. So Stephen Pressfield believes a lot in the messages from the universe. So there's a bit of mysticism in his work, but who cares? We take what we want to use from his work. And he gives various examples of this shadow life. He talks about a girl whose addiction was always chasing romances and always chasing love. And he said she was very, very talented, and this was a cope mechanism for not doing not following one of her very talents. Because it's okay to pursue love, but she was pursuing love, and every time it would end to drama and heartbreak, and he thinks for her it was a coping mechanism. So Pressfield uses a lot the parallel between the addict and the amateur. He says, the difference between an amateur and a professional is their habits. An amateur has amateur habits, a professional has professional habits. And he says, if you think about it, the addict is an interesting person. The addict is going to do anything to go after stuff. And yet this stuff that they're going after is not what they really, really want. So he says, addiction is boring, but the addicts are super interesting people. And yet they throw their life away. He talks about people who are addicted not only to drugs, but as he put it, people who are addicted to themselves. He talks about narcissists. And actually he mentions Trump. And that's actually true. A narcissist, I mean, it's difficult not to say that Trump is not a fascinating personality. And at the same time, he's very boring, because at the end of the day, like, what is in there? This reminds me a section from The Fountainhead. And it's where Dominique discusses with Stephen Mallory. And they talk about people who, when they're not in their course, when they're not in their purpose, every day you look at them and they've changed a bit from the previous day. It's like something inside them dies. These people might have been fascinating prospects. Like, Peter Keating was a prospect, if you think about it. He was charming. I'm sure he was talented in some things, if he went after it. And yet, when they're not in their track, when they're not in their purpose, every day something dies in them. And at the end of the day, you have this person who is, quote, a character, but there's not much there. That's why Pressfield calls the addicts, quote, beautiful losers. And then he talks again about, he gives many examples around the amateur. And he says, usually with amateurs, and again he used the example of the addicts, there's a lot of drama in their life. Their life is like a soap opera. But this is because maybe they had inside them an actual drama, an actual opera that they could create or put on the paper, and to avoid this, they make a petty drama of their life. But at the end of the day, again, there's nothing glorious in that petty drama. Whereas he says in the life of the pro, there's not much drama. Actually, the life of the pro is boring. He says, for example, the Zen monk or the artist or the entrepreneur, if you think about it, their lives is boring. If you made a TV series out of it, it could be boring. But this doesn't mean it's devoid of meaning. Then he talks about resistance. Remember, resistance is the main theme in his book, The War of Art. So he says, when you are young, you experience a calling. For the first time, you realize, this is what I want to be. And he says, notice that immediately you see something which supposedly blocks it. Something that tells you why you can't do it. So he says there's this vision of the higher realized self we might become, followed by fear, self-doubt, self-sabotage. Enter a drink, a lover, a habit. So you start something else because you're too afraid to go to the thing that you really want. Addiction, he says, replaces aspiration. And I was thinking about it. When I first discovered Objectivism, at the same time, I rediscovered my passion for basketball. And I was spending too much time on very technical, higher level kind of basketball websites, analyzing the tactics, trying to understand the game. And now in retrospect, I think, why was I doing this? Maybe because my life in the university was not very fulfilling. Actually, was not fulfilling at all. So I had this other imaginary thing. Like, I was admiring this great mind, the basketball coaches, and how creative they are, how they're after something which is real in terms of I have a goal and I go after it. And could this be that this was actually a cope for me not pursuing what was my big calling, my own title and or the ring, which is what you get at the end of the season in basketball, which was pursuing a career in an intellectual career. Or maybe my whole life has been a cope against my real passion, which would be basketball, but I don't think this is the case. So, quite often, again, a habit or something you think you like is something that stands in the way on what you actually have to do, claims Pressfield. So, then he talks again about, he keeps coming back about the addict, and he says, please observe the addict. And he says the addict is a dramatic hero because it's a metaphor of what could have been human greatness. Because he says, notice how the addict will stop at nothing to get to what he wants. But unfortunately, what he wants is crack or heroin. I saw a tweet the other day which says, don't be out-hustled by a crackhead or something. It meant, if they, in their condition, really go after what they want, what stops you going from what you want? This is what Pressfield says. The addict as dramatic hero. Again, a hero, though, pursuing the opposite, pursuing something which is distracting from him rather than his true calling. Then he talks about the idea of pulling the pin. again, he goes back to one of these careers that he had. I think it was a career about picking apples, very difficult job. And he says there he met very interesting people. People who their life would not go anywhere, and they ended up being seasonal manual laborers. But he said all of these people were actually interesting people. It's just that at some point they gave up. And he says usually you'd see them, they would also give up from this manual labor. One day you'd wake up, they would all sleep like together in a hostel or something, they would have disappeared. And in the lingo of that job, this was called pulling the pin. And Pressfield says, I could relate to pulling the pin. I pulled the pin on my first book, 99.9% of the way through. So he wrote a book and he quit just before the end. I pulled the pin on my marriage. I had never done anything in my life to that point where I hadn't pulled the pin. So Pressfield sees the people quitting and actually says, wait a minute, I've done the same. I've done the same in my life. And he would see them and he would notice that these people live more like animals rather than human beings. But he doesn't say this to offend them. Animals live in circles without a direction. Again, this is something we see in Ayn Rand. Remember Dagny in the cabin in Atlas Shrugged, thinking, like, how can you live a life which is not a straight line, which is a proper life for a human being? But Pressfield said these people live like in circles. And then again, he realizes, isn't this how I was living? And now I realize that this is also indeed how I was living in my university career. Again, nothing against university professors. Some people find it very fulfilling, more power to them. I didn't find it fulfilling. And it had this circular thing. Oh, September till October till May, you teach, then you mark, and like it goes where? So Steven Pressfield has his epiphany that, hey, I'm like these people, and these people have all this potential. These are great people. They're fun to talk to. And yet they have made peace with their decline. So what is the amateur life then? He says, repetition without progress. Repetition without progress. Circle. So then he talks about, he comes back. By the way, there's no proper structure to the book. Sometimes it sounds a bit like stream of consciousness, or there is a structure that is not super clear to me. So now he starts talking about different types of addiction. And I'm going to skip some, but the most interesting is what he calls addicted to failure. And this is something that hits a nerve for me. He says, each time we fail, we're secretly relieved. There is glamour to failure. There's a payoff to failure, he says, which is incapacity. It's like, well, okay, what else can I do? I tried, I failed. He calls it a get out of jail free card. And I've seen this also in sports. People are saying failure is a habit. It becomes your home. You feel safe at it. And I said it hits a home. It hits home because, not to get into too personal stories, but even when you get to a point where you constantly say, okay, I need to change things in my life, there are things inside you that want to drag you back to failure. Maybe your own body wants to drag you back to being unhappy. When I was about to sign in my resignation to my university and sign my contract with the Ayn Rand Institute, for almost 45 days, I had I'm taking this back. I had considerable and noticeable problems like with my body. I thought I had actual symptoms. And they were very, very real. Magically, when I signed in the resignation and when I signed my contract, within days, they disappeared. Now, this is not mumbo jumbo. Obviously, this was some stress, but in my mind, the decision was very clear. I was never actually more confident for a decision. But it was also a big decision. So my body said, let's go back where we're safe. So this definitely, addiction to failure is a thing. Then he talks about addiction to sex. Oh yeah, I think that's a first world problem for many people. I'll skip it. Addicted to distraction. So why addiction to distraction? Because he says distraction is about two qualities. Resistance, actually, he says. Again, resistance is the enemy of doing what you really need to do. Resistance, he says, hates two qualities, concentration and depth. Because when you concentrate and when you do deep work, then this is a path to success. And again, resistance wants to hold you back. It's your old self with the things that is safe and familiar with. So resistance wants to keep us shallow and unfocused, and this is why so many people are prone to distractions. He wrote this more than 10 years ago, so today, in the era of TikTok and stuff, this would be more relevant. Then he talks about addiction to money. Again, that's a bit of a first world problem. And so I'll skip. But addiction to trouble. Addiction to trouble. So he says there are more than 2 million people in prisons and 5 million people on probation in the US. These numbers are a bit exaggerated, but you get the point. And he says trouble sometimes is intoxicating. Because he says, how often do we see people getting out of prison and then going back to prison? And of course, Pressfield is not like a conservative elitist. He understands the struggles. But he says sometimes we feel at home with trouble. We feel at home. Trouble is the territory that we know. And he says prison sometimes keeps you safe. Prison is actually a release from the struggle of having to do what you really want to do in life. In other words, freedom is a responsibility. Then is the best chapter of the book, and in my view, the best chapter in any book I have ever read. At least self-development book. And it's his year of turning pro. I like this chapter so much that I bought the Kindle version just so I could have this chapter available anytime. I'd be tempted to read the whole chapter, but it's going to be a bit tedious maybe. Anyway, he was 31. I did the math, this was 1974. He had saved some money after working these seasonal jobs, and he moves to a small town in California. And he finds a house for $105 per month. You can understand this was no palace. And he decides that it's time to turn pro. So he says, I didn't talk to anybody during my year of turning pro. I didn't hang out, I just work. I had the book in my mind and I had decided I would finish it or kill myself. This is determination, right? He decided I'm either gonna write this book or that's it with my life. Quote, I could not run away again or let people down again or let myself down again. This was it. Do or die. So, no radio, no TV, no sports. He would just work. He would just visit one person who was like a mentor who would give him information about, not information, like guidance on which books to read. And that was it. He would eat the same things. So for morning he would have eggs and liver, nutritious. And when he would run out of money, he would go back to picking apples and doing seasonal labor. And then he says, one day I typed the end. I had finished something. What happens then? Not much. The book was not good enough and he knew it. Then he writes another book, also not good enough, and he knew it. Then he delivers, I think, 9 scripts or something, and they're not good. So why was this so important? This was so important because, quote, in the end it didn't matter. I was truly productive. I was truly facing my demons. So he did the work. That year, he says, made me a pro. And that year, he says, has stuck with him. So he goes on a mission. Either I go for my life's purpose or I don't even want to live anymore. And he succeeded in terms of doing what his purpose was. He was 31. He knew all his life he wanted to be a writer. This was the first time that he took seriously, I'm going to be a writer. He failed for long, but he proved to himself that he would be a writer. Okay, then he goes on to some dark, malevolent universe premise, the pain of being human, different types of despair. I don't find much value to that. Anyway, that's just me. Then he talks about something called accidental incapacitation. And he talks about World War I, where soldiers would shoot their feet in order to avoid the battle, the nightmare that was World War I. And he says sometimes we do the same things. So he says the amateur tries to escape the war he knows how he has to fight, and he injures himself metaphorically in order to do so. So then he talks again about the amateur. He says the amateur is terrified. Fear is what is motivating him. What type of fear? The fear of being excluded from the tribe. So remember what we said. When you're an amateur, you feel you have your life, you belong, you have your social kind of environment. Things are familiar. But if he turns pro and lives the life he really wants to live, then he has to be faithful not to others but to himself. Now we see slowly how the amateur is the second-hander. The amateur and the second-hander are the same person. Funny enough, conventional morality, right? He describes this, the amateur is an egotist, whereas he describes the exact opposite, that amateur is the second-hander. Quote, the amateur competes with others and believes that he cannot rise unless a competitor falls. This is Peter Keating. So what he describes the amateur being an egotist, he means the amateur being a second-hander. So the opposite of an egotist. Rourke is a pro, Keating is an amateur. So again, the amateur craves third-party validation. The amateur is tyrannized by his imagined conception of what is expected from him. And that's very interesting, because he sacrifices his future and current, actually, happiness for other people, for what other people expect from him. So here's how I came across it some years ago. I don't remember who said it. He said, imagine 20 years from now, you've achieved everything you wanted to achieve. Let's say you want to be a writer. You're a writer. You live in a mansion by the sea. But in the way of becoming, like one friend from school thought, who's a loser today, thought that, that's ridiculous. Oh, he wants to be a writer. And there are like 3 people in YouTube that make nasty comments. Would you ever say that, it's not worth it where I am today because that friend from high school or these 3 people online said nasty things? Of course not. What you've achieved is so much more important. Therefore, if in retrospect you would say, who cares about these distractions in the way? I'll go my own way. Why is it that today your mind is so stuck to, what will people say? So this is actually Pressfield's message. Be an egoist, he says the opposite, don't be an egotist, but in our language, in the objective language, be selfish, be properly selfish. Don't sacrifice your value to the values of others. So he says the amateur remains inauthentic, someone other than who he really is. Then again, he talks about distractions and instant gratification. These are cope mechanisms. And remember in Fountainhead, that scene where Peter Keating is with Dominique. And because he's a guy with no values, he's like, well, what can we do? Well, there's nothing to do tonight. We invited these people the other day. There's nothing to say. How can we kill time? And he realized, oh my God, why do I want to kill time? There's something wrong with it. Of course, because he's an evader, he tries to forget it very quickly. The amateur seeks permission. Again, imagine Tuhi and giving Peter Keating wanting the permission of others in whatever he wants to do. And the amateur is encouraged, unfortunately, by our culture of low expectation. So Pressfield says, my beef with American culture is that almost every aspect has been debased to pander to the culture of amateurism. The promise that our products and politicians proffer is the promise one might make to an infant or an addict. I will get you what you want and it will cost you nothing. Of course, the pro doesn't buy into this. He knows that only he can get what he wants and it will cost dearly. But dearly in terms of effort, but the reward is totally worth it. Then he talks about the amateur who is always, I'm going to do it tomorrow. The amateur basically cares about the past or the future, never the present. Why? Because this makes sure that he doesn't have to do anything in the now. Something else very related to objectivism. So he says, the force that can save the amateur is awareness, particularly self-awareness. But then the amateur tries to make sure that he doesn't get to this self-awareness. In other words, the amateur tries to evade. Because if he gets the self-conscious of, if he does the introspection and figure out what he wants, he will realize it, but I haven't done this. And then he will realize that, what type of person does this make me? What type of integrity am I showing to myself? So he prefers to evade. Evasion, Ayn Rand says, is the cardinal of sins. And then he goes back to what he was saying about the tribe, that we want to be loyal to the tribe, qua second-handers. And he says, here's the truth. The tribe doesn't give a shit. There is no tribe. So all these people online that you worry that they're going to make fun of you or that friend from high school, they have their own lives. They have their own troubles, struggles. So just do your own thing. No one cares. And even if they care, you shouldn't care. Then he talks about, again, he goes back and forth. Then he talks about part-time pros. He says there are people who are good in their shadow career, and this can make it even more difficult to realize it's a shadow career. So, for example, I was quite good as a university lecturer. So it could be very easy to become complacent and say, well, that's it for me. Well, there's always this other dream, but let's keep what we want. And here we get to the second most important part of the book, or most important for me. Actually, this is the most insightful. The year in that small house where he turned pro, it's the most inspiring, but this is the biggest takeaway for me. Life gets very simple when you turn pro. Life gets very simple when you turn pro. You hear the voice, he says, in our heads, it clicks, like, yeah, there's no doubt. That's what I want to do. Now, what does it mean that life gets simple? It means that when you have what is a central purpose? A central purpose gives you guidance on how to organize the rest of your hierarchy of values. What shall I do? Where I should do things that align with that purpose. For example, a simple example. If you're an athlete, shall you go out and club till 3 in the morning and eat junk food? No, it doesn't align with your central purpose. Therefore, your central purpose tells you what you need to do. So once you turn pro, your day changes, he says. The activities you do. It changes the time you get up, the time you go to bed, what you eat. He says even the shape of your body will change when you turn pro. Whereas when you're amateur, the day is full, but at the end of the day it's empty. Because you do so many things and they lead to nothing. Keating's day is very full. And it adds up to what? To a zero. Circle, not a straight line. But not only your day changes when you turn pro, people also change, he says. There will be people, you lose them from your life. There will be people who will resent you. Maybe not consciously, they will try to drag you back to the old habits. Hey, let's go drink or whatever. But at the same time, he says, new people will appear. So remember Howard Roark, how he finds new friends as he goes deeper into his purpose. Stephen Mallory, Dominique, what's the day of that worker, Gail Wynand later. Another thing that changes is, he says, the way your mindset. So he talks about how alcoholics overcome addiction, and the motto is one day at a time. And he says the same happens with a pro. The professional deals with stuff one day at a time. Why? Because the demons and the powers that want to drag you back to being an amateur are always going to be there. Resistance is always going to be there. So every day is a new battle against resistance. Of course, the more conscious you are about your purpose, the easier it is to win this battle. This section reminds me a book by the great basketball manager Rick Pitino. The book is called One Day Contract. I haven't read the book, but from the title I know what it means. That his point is every day, like imagine if you would keep your job on a day-by-day contract. So every day you have to show up and earn it again. And this is a very nice way to view it. I have my dream job these days at the Ayn Rand Institute. I should view it every day. My contract is out to negotiation. So did I live up to having this job and pursuing my purpose? Then he says the moment you turn pro is like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or the assassination of Kennedy. Everyone remembers where they were. And he gives two examples. I will talk about the second one. Remember, Pressfield had this dream about suddenly having a tidy room, and this told him, hey, be ambitious. So he believes in dreams. So here he discusses the dream of Roseanne Cass. I don't know her, but it's a fascinating story. So in her dream, so she was someone who was successful, but she didn't do exactly what she wanted to do in life, which was to be a songwriter. So one night she sleeps, and in her dream, she's sitting on a table with another singer and with an elderly man. His name, I somehow knew, was Art, capital A Art. He and the other person were talking animatedly, deeply engrossed in their conversation. I tried to enter the discussion and made the comment to the old man. He turned his head slowly from the other woman to me and looked me up and down with obvious disdain and an undisguised lack of interest. We don't respect dilettantes, he spat out and turned back to the other person. So this figure that encompassed Art basically told her, you're an amateur and we don't talk to amateurs. To make this dream relevant to the Objectivist universe, if you're familiar with it, this would be the equivalent. I have a dream that I chat with, Yaron Brook, and there's someone else there who encompasses, objectivism or whatever. And they chat and I try to enter the discussion and they're like, what do you want here, amateur? So after this dream, you're like, wow, it's time I stop being an amateur. So then she talks about Carl Jung, who says that every person has 5 big dreams in their life that are moments in their life, and she thinks this was one of these moments. And actually, I think there is something to it, that quite often we have dreams that really put us in a path. I've heard people saying they realized that they were in love because they saw that person in a dream. Of course, it's very obvious to see why this is the case, because our dreams are just our subconscious, things that we haven't paid much attention to. So from that day, she said she changed how she approached life and how she approached songwriting. So again, a familiar theme in Pressfield, something happens, and this was a humiliating dream, right? So quite often what happens is something that brings you shame, something that makes you feel uncomfortable. So Steven Pressfield remembers another moment that was a key moment in his journey to becoming pro. He dragged out his type machine. He was living in a mess of a house in New York. He tried for 2 hours to write something, and he ended up with something that was crap, so he threw it away. And then he goes to the kitchen. There were 10 days of dishes. Imagine it was a mess. And he started washing it. And while he washes the dishes, he feels a clarity. That reminds me of the film Limitless, by the way. I think part of his journey is he starts washing the dishes and creating a nice environment. But the key is he felt this clarity and this peace because he had written. What he'd written didn't add up to anything, but it was the beginning of a path. Today I wrote 1 page, it took me 2 hours, and it was crap. But still I wrote. That's the message. So he says that, do you understand? I hadn't written anything good. It might be years before I would, if I ever did at all. That didn't matter. What counted was that I had, after years of running from it, actually sat down and done my work. He talks about epiphanies, and he says that epiphanies can be embarrassing. They can bring shame. Remember that dream of that woman. So I don't remember the moment I turned pro. I'm not even sure if I have turned pro. But I remember such a moment of shame that was epiphany. An embarrassing moment that was an epiphany. Actually, more than one. But I'll mention just one. I was discussing with Tal Svani, the CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute, the prospect of me moving full-time on objectivism and becoming more disciplined in what I'm doing. And he said something like, you're gonna turn 40. How much more years do you think you have to do something with your life? Or you think you're good, but when I see you in a stream, I see a guy shouting. There's not much there. Now, one could hear this and say, oh my God, that's like horrible. But he was right. I was, back then, I was 37. I wasn't doing what I wanted to do. It would be so easy to let 5 more years pass. So Tal was totally right. That was a moment that made me think, I have to change something. There was a moment my favorite moment in Steve Jobs' biography. He calls someone, an engineer in another company, and he's selling pitches. You haven't done anything in your life till today, so come and work for me. Okay, this doesn't work for everyone. It totally worked for that guy, and what Tal told me totally worked for me. So sometimes epiphanies can be painful. So we move on. He talks about the characteristics of the professional. He gives like a shopping list. Nothing super unusual here. The professional, is patient, shows up every day, does not take failure personally, endures adversity, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about the professional having his own standards. The professional, he says, is ruthless with himself, and he gives a fascinating example. So Picasso was at his studio in Paris, and there was a guy who would exhibit all these works that he had worked for in his gallery. And he says at some point Picasso takes a knife and starts slicing all these pieces of art. Why? Because, he said, he knew they were not good enough. They were not up to his standard. He was Picasso. The standards of Picasso are different from the standards of the gallery owner. And the same happens with every professional. The professional knows when he has fallen short of his own standards, says Pressfield. Remember that discussion in the Fountainhead where Gail Wynand asks Rourke, quote, "Do you ever do awful stuff?" And Rourke replies, quote, "Probably more of it than any other architect and with less excuse. The only distinction I can claim is that my botches ended up in my own wastebasket." End of quote. So the first-hander, he knows when he's not up to his standards, but he takes ownership of it. Then again, he talks about not being distracted, and he has a nice line. He says, "I'm guilty of checking my email. Are you? We're crazy. What do we imagine we're going to find in our inbox?" So quite often we go to the email like, oh, there's going to be that. Like, how often do you really expect a very important email? So quite often procrastination is productive procrastination. We think we're doing something important, but this is just, again, resistance. We know we have to do something else, but we don't want to do the really important thing. Then he talks about inspiration. How do we get inspiration? Quite often, artists or creators think the way to get inspiration is drink, smoke, be undisciplined. He says it's the opposite. The professional does not wait for inspiration. He acts in anticipation of it. He knows that when the muse sees his butt in the chair, she will deliver. So, artists and creators need discipline even more, if not at the same degree as all the other productive people. And this is why his first book, The War of Art, was so impactful. Actually, Joe Rogan says that he has a pack of it and he gives to his friends like comedians and stuff who have talent, but they're not disciplined to do the job. Then he says something interesting about people you have as idols, people you look up to. And he says, when we project a quality or virtue onto another human being, we ourselves almost always possess that quality, but we're afraid to embrace and to live that truth. So it's good to look up to people, but he says, don't just be a groupie. Know that you can live that, you can experience that. So think about it this way. Let's say I look up to someone like Jocko Willink. He's very disciplined. He's doing many different things in his life. But instead of just admiring him, I could try and at least do some of the things follow some of the systems he's following to try to also be someone that I'm proud of in terms of my values and in terms of what I want to achieve in life. So don't just have heroes, try to be yourself that hero, because the fact that you're a hero means they have things that they are inside you and you can thrive towards them. This could have been, I would have put it much simpler. Hope you got the point. Okay, then he goes back to one possible objection, which is, okay, but if you're an artist, if you're so disciplined, you just eat liver and eggs and you wake up every day the same time, doesn't this suffocate your talent? And he says, no. And here he talks about magic. He says, in order to achieve flow, magic, the zone, we start by being common and ordinary and workmanlike. So, sit on your desk and do the job, and the magic will find you. You cannot find the magic by saying, oh, now I'll drink and the inspiration will come. going back to Jocko Willink, discipline equals freedom. The more disciplined you are, the more the muse is going to find you. Then he switched gears. He talks about the idea of the two salaries. So he gives the example of a Marine gunner sergeant who one of his young Marines told him, hey, you know what, we're getting paid not much, not enough money. He says, yes, that's true, but you're getting two salaries. The one is the meek salary you are getting in the bank. The other is the pride that you have that you're doing something that so few people can do, and you're proud of yourself and you're part of this brotherhood. And Pressfield says, I get that. The struggle is real. Often you wonder, is this worth it? Quote, we bust our butts training and practicing and studying and rehearsing, and nobody shows up. Nobody notices. Nobody even knows we exist. No wonder people quit. But, he says, at the end of the day, quote, we're like that Marine who sleeps in a foxhole in the freezing rain, but who knows a secret that only he and his brothers and sisters shares. So at the end of the day, if you enjoy what you do, you're doing it for yourself. All the struggle is worth it. Of course, you always need to have a sincere discussion with yourself. Am I as good as I could have been? Maybe I need to fix the course. But at the end of the day, even if no one shows up, you do something, you are true to your values, you're true to your purpose. Then he goes back to his years in the wilderness, and he says that he was actually lucky that he went through all these struggles. These struggles were important. Why? Because they made him 100% sure about what was his mission. So he tried doing other things. He worked manual labor, he worked more office jobs, some actually even prestigious jobs, but he couldn't do it. Whatever he was trying to do, something was pulling him towards writing. Maybe nobody else liked the stuff I was doing, but I did. He talks about his writing. I was learning. I was getting better. The score will take care of itself, as that great book mentions, that other book that I've mentioned in another video on Rourke and productivity. The score will take care of itself. You do the good work, and the results will come. Then again, he talks about discipline, like your practice should have a time and a place. And he says, when we convene day upon day in the same space at the same time, a powerful energy builds up around us. The goddess sees this energy and she rewards it. So again, how do I get the inspiration to do work? Sit down and do the work. As Jocko Willink says, how do you become good at push-ups? Do more push-ups. Then he leaves us with an optimist message. He talks about the Spartan king Agesilaus, who was still fighting in armor until he was 82. I should have checked this out if it's true, but who cares? It's a great story. And also he says Picasso was painting until he was 90 and Henry Miller was chasing women till at 89. So he says when we turn pro, there is no finish line. When you do something you're passionate about, there is no finish line. And then towards the end, he has some good advice on what to do in difficult days. Not every day, even if you show up and do the work, not every day is going to be a very productive day. So he says, quote, take what the defense gives you. This is taken from American football. In the basketball, would say stay in the game. Make sure you stay close to the opponent, and then maybe in a different stage of the game, you will have your time. So he says, maybe you had a bad day, but you know, whatever. We're pros, we're not amateurs. Tomorrow we'll be here again. Maybe we had 2 bad days. Maybe we had 10 bad days. We'll be back. We're here for the long run. So stay in the game. Take what the defense gives you. And also he says, play hurt. Try to think, how does a basketball player, how is his body feeling in the playoffs? How hurt must he feel? Or think about the the coaching staff. With all the travel, they have to analyze the game straight after How much sleep do they get during the playoffs? Who cares? You're a pro, play hurt, is his message. Or as he puts it, the professional takes 2 aspirin and keeps on tracking. And then he ends up with a weird story. Both in the War of Art, the end is a bit mystic. He talks about he visits this Maasai tribe, and this shaman says, I sense there's a bad spirit, and he takes the whole tribe and relocates it 200 meters further. Like, what happened now? The spirit disappeared. But Pressfield he finds it fascinating, and he says, damn right I want that shaman. He's my man. I love the guy. In lieu of the shaman, I have what? So he's trying to figure out, I also need some direction. But he does something. Quote, I have a code of professionalism. I have virtues that I seek to strengthen and vices that I labor to eradicate. So he hasn't got the shaman, he got his pro code. So your pro code is your guide. And he ends up with some a bit more mystical stuff. He talked about the Kabbalah code, the Kabbalistic studies. And according to the Kabbalistic tradition, there are 2 selves inside you. The one is the shadow self. So the shadow self tries to pull you back, tries to literally destroy you, because the shadow self wants to keep you to the familiar. But there is also the Musar, it's called in that tradition, self, which is the self that wants to actualize itself and wants to keep you away. So here we come back to the most common theme in the book, the shadow life and the life of the professional. Why shadow? Because it's at the shadow of who you could have been. That's a life which is familiar. We think it's easy, but actually it's not easy because it leads to misery and leads to you not feeling fulfilled. So he says, what we call this in Kabbalah, higher self, the Musar, he calls pro. So this is the book Turning Pro by Steven Pressfield. I'm reading it once every year, and it's every time it works. You might not agree with everything, with the mystical stuff, but my point is I approach books selfishly. I take away whatever I want to take away, whatever fits within the context of my life, and I'm so glad this book exists, and I hope that after this 1 hour and 5 minutes you also got some value out of it. Talk soon.